At Royal Roads University, it's always important that we begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional lands. So, Royal Roads University acknowledges that this campus is located on the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and Lekwungen ancestors and families. It's with great gratitude that we live, learn, and work here, where the past and present and future scopes of Indigenous and non Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. This is a great time to give that chat box a test. So feel free to go back to that black bar, click that chat box button, and let us know, where in the world are you joining us from today? We are so lucky to have some wonderful organizations partnering to bring this conversation to life together today. One of which being Royal Roads University. We are thrilled to have our School of Humanitarian Studies, Master of Arts in Human Security and Peacebuilding sponsoring today's dialogue. On the slide, you see a quick spattering of all of the different programs hosted within the School of Humanitarian Studies. So if you have any questions, feel free to connect with us at learn.more@royalroads.ca. And our wonderful co-sponsor for today is the Canadian International Council, also known as CIC. The Canadian International Council is a platform for citizens to engage in discussion on international issues. Their mission is to involve Canadians in defining our country's place in the world. So if you have any more questions about the Canadian International Council, you can find them at their website, thecic.org, or send them an email at info@thecic.org. And with that, let's begin our conversation today. I will pass the microphone over to our moderator, Chris.
Thank you, Selena, and hello, everyone. My name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria. And I'm so delighted that we were able to join with Royal Roads University today to put on this important event. And I'd also like to say hello to my panelists as well for taking the time to join us this morning. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we're an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with an express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs. And what makes us a little different from many think tanks in Canada is that we do have 19 branches across the country. And just here in Victoria and on the island, we have 400 members. And I'm proud to say that we just started a new branch in Whitehorse last week. So this morning, what's going to happen is I'm going to set the scene with a few comments and then introduce our three panelists who will speak briefly about their experiences in Afghanistan, their thoughts for the future of the country, and then we'll have ample time for your questions. So let's get started. And I have to say right off the top, how time flies. It was only back in April 2021 that US President Joe Biden announced that by the 11th of September 2021, 20 years to the day after 9/11, that the United States would withdraw all of its troops from Afghanistan. Of course, we now know that events in Washington and Kabul folded much faster than the international community ever expected. As we've all heard many times, I suspect the US-Afghan war is the longest war that America has ever fought. It lasted through two George W. Bush administrations, the two Barack Obama administrations, and the Donald Trump administration. The war in Afghanistan was also Canada's longest war, from 2001 to 2014, and our first significant combat engagement since the Korean War. It took just a week for the Taliban, from August 9th to the 16th, to conquer the first major city in Afghanistan and then the last. And then almost immediately, the finger pointing began, especially in the United States. In Canada also, the finger pointing began. And with the Canadian embassy in Kabul closed, many Afghans who'd served alongside our military or in other supporting roles were left to fend for themselves. In numerous cases, individuals and private groups came to the rescue. To their credit, our diplomats and military were able to return to Kabul in very difficult circumstances to save as many as they could. Officially, Canada has announced the resettlement of up to 40,000 vulnerable Afghan nationals to Canada, but much less than this number has arrived. And just looking at the information available this morning, I think it's well under 4,000. Elsewhere, we are seeing reports from example, the Norwegian Refugee Council that has just said recently that since the Taliban has taken over in Afghanistan, 3,000 to 5,000 Afghans are crossing the Iranian border every single day. Now, the debate today is what to do. And in an international community, it's all about averting a humanitarian disaster. The Taliban is listed as a terrorist organization by Canada and many other states, that they are in charge. And the irony now is that the Taliban have little choice to come cap in hand to the very same international community that they just forced out of the country. And they themselves did everything they could to undermine any sort of progress in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. I'm sure many of the audience are also aware of the 1979 Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and that violence has ensnared the country for decades. To explore all of this and more, I'm pleased to have today with me our three panelists who have a great deal of experience serving or working in Afghanistan. And I also spent 1 year at our embassy in Kabul in 2009 to 2010 as the deputy military attaché. Our panelists, in the order that they will be speaking this morning, include Dr. Athena Madan with Royal Road's Department of Human Security and Peacebuilding program. She has worked in Afghanistan as a health worker, supporting midwifery training, maternal and child health intervention, addictions intervention, and the rehabilitation of child soldiers with local non-governmental organizations since 2012. After Athena speaks, Corey will join us, formerly with United Nations Women on the Ground in Kabul, where she has recently returned in June, and who is now working night and day to help settle Afghans in our country and to help them out while they're still in Afghanistan. After Corey, we have Dr. Weiss Area, who is a medical doctor specializing in psychosocial interventions for internally displaced persons in his home country of Afghanistan. And he himself was evacuated in August from Kabul. So welcome to everyone that's joined us. I'm delighted to see we have so many people in the room, so to speak. And panelists, it's your turn. Athena, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this space, and I'm grateful for you being here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you. And it's a great pleasure to join my collaborators, Dr. Arya and Corey and Chris, all of you on this panel. And like many of you who are gathered here today, many of us have different experiences working or serving in Afghanistan and supporting Afghan people. And so it is from this space that my remarks will be framed today. Let me share my screen. I have prepared a couple of slides just to give a different view to some of my remarks. And I probably won't take the full 7 to 10 minutes that's allotted here, but I just wanted to, I just would like to share a couple of visuals, and the remarks that I have will just frame what we're looking at within the Canadian context and comparing the Canadian to global, just understanding the Canadian context in the global context. I'd also like to reserve most of my time for someone who's been I haven't been in the country since 2018, and I would like to reserve my time for reserve the time for Dr. Arya as a Kabuli voice, and Corey, who's been there more recently. So for the past 3 years, as Chris has mentioned, Canada has been recognized by the UNHCR as a world leader in the resettlement of refugees, ranking first among 26 countries. So my hope that today, the last of 4 webinars that we've put together at Royal Roads about Afghanistan in this series, we can learn from some of the experiences faced by our Afghan friends and colleagues and continue discussing what we can do in Canada to support Afghan passage, autonomy, and security. This particular picture that you see here is a recent September 2021 photo from the Chinese National Press. I'm just highlighting this particular image first in that there, within the IDP resettlement camps, there is some organized response to IDPs, which you see in this picture, but more frequently in past experience and from what I'm hearing now on the ground, people are scattered throughout the country without formal organization supporting their passage. And that is where I think most of my remarks are settling in today, and most of my energies and empathies are with Afghan nationals today. Also to highlight that this particular picture, given that it is from the Chinese press, it's difficult to find current pictures, current stats from many international actors at the moment, because the Taliban, as we know, is realigning their alliances and picking nations with whom they'd like to build strategic alliances with that are excluding traditional international presence in Afghanistan. So for those of you who are here today, thanks for attending these webinars, and in the spirit of discussions that we've been able to generate, in the next few minutes, I'll share some of my observations about IDPs in Afghanistan and the Afghan context. Let me switch slides. So in the in the global context, an unprecedented 84 million people around the world have been forced to flee their homes. This translates globally into roughly 1 in every 92 people. While around 30 million are able to access resources and assistance to qualify as refugees or asylum seekers in different countries, the majority of those refugees, 48 million, remain internally displaced within their own countries. Effectively, they remain stateless, they are denied community, and are excluded from access to basic rights such as education, healthcare, employment, and freedom of movement. The majority of internationally displaced peoples and refugees statistically are often children under the age of 18. And what we see in the slide before you in Afghanistan, the numbers of children, are over the international average. What we see here in the Afghan context is the sum of internally displaced people are about 668,000 people. 99,000 of those are families. And as you can see in the graph on the right, according to the numbers from this is from OCHA, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We did see a spike in May and June, preceding when the United States troops started to withdraw. We don't, surprisingly, according to this graph, I didn't see a spike in the numbers around August when Kabul fell. But I think that, according to what I'm hearing from some of my former colleagues who are, now in different countries around the world, and a few who are still in Kabul, what we can probably anticipate, or I anticipated that there would be a spike in numbers around August. What I'm seeing in this graph is that there are no reported numbers, probably because of the evacuation of many international personnel whose responsibilities and whose work involved the tabulation of these numbers in order to disseminate out. So while I don't see a spike in those numbers, all the reports that I'm hearing is that there are spikes in numbers, upwards of close to 100,000 in August of 2021. So these numbers hopefully can tell a larger story that what we're looking at, this always does this when I'm on Zoom. So here's a picture of the geography of Afghanistan and the geography of movement of IDPs. You'll see on the left in the graph that children under 18 is larger than the international statistic of 48% typically minors. About 60% of the IDPs right now are children under 18. About half and half of those, we have equal numbers of males and females as we see them traveling in families. And locations with displacements, most of them, the movements tended to be from the rural areas to the urban centers, but then we are also seeing a reverse in the migration back out to the rural areas and closer to the border areas of Iran, Pakistan, and Tajikistan in order to migrate out of the country. So Afghanistan is seeing an enormous rise in the number of IDPs since the withdrawal of foreign troops in May, and I anticipate, and from what I'm hearing on the ground, but has not been officially recorded, since the fall of Kabul and seat of government in August, according to data from this United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. We see that at least 244,000 people have been internally displaced since this beginning of May, and an increase of more than 300% compared with the same period last year. Most of the people are fleeing from the northeastern and eastern Afghanistan. All lack adequate shelter, nearly all lack adequate shelter, access to medical care, and sufficient food. I am a former Doctors Without Borders volunteer, and MSF is still operational in some of the areas of Afghanistan, and they are able to put up makeshift medical centers, but the ability to access people in transit has been very, very difficult. And it traditionally was difficult before the present instance because most of the IDPs tend to seek, as I said in the earlier at the beginning of my remarks, many IDPs lack formal ways of organizing and settling camps. So they tend to travel in smaller groups for their own safety and security, sometimes just as their own immediate families. And those people are particularly difficult to reach as they seek out refuge in the mountain terrain. As I said earlier, also it's many initially had fled their homes in rural areas due to fighting, seeking refuge in provincial capitals. That seems to be the reverse now, as people are tending to migrate out to around Pakistan and even crossing the mountainous terrain in the north of the country to Tajikistan. So as the Taliban advances in different areas of regional control in Kabul, the IDP numbers are expected to increase. It's an important distinction also, and I've said this in or we've highlighted this in each of the webinars, but the Taliban is a diffuse term, and the interpretation of the Taliban means someone who has learnt in the Quran, or a religious scholar of the text of Islam. So the interpretation of what that means with respect to governing a particular region tends to be different across those regions. So then you see increases in people migrating out without any particular, as you might see in different countries, there tend to be particular routes of migration to a neighboring country. In Afghanistan, we see that there isn't typical routes of passage for an IDP. So that you can understand and relate these numbers in context, Afghanistan and Canada have roughly the same population. Afghanistan has 38.9 million people, Canada has 38.1. So Canada is slightly less in population, but Afghanistan is roughly the size in Manitoba in square kilometers, or if you're more amenable to, I notice most of the people here seem to be coming in from Canada, but if you're amenable to American geography, Texas is a little bit larger than the kilometerage of Afghanistan. But I provide this context that you can understand the numbers of people who live in the country and the terrain that people might want to voyage across. So it is my hope today that as I pass the speaking baton to my colleagues, Corey and Dr. Arya, that we might be able to discuss a little bit about not what's happened per se. We've discussed that in some of our previous webinars. I expect that it will be a background context to the remarks today, but also what do we need to know, what can we do, and how can we best respond and help support and avert a pending humanitarian crisis. Chris mentioned in his earlier remarks that as the winter settles in Afghanistan, it can be particularly dire for people who don't have adequate shelter or housing. Also, as the economic situation in Afghanistan is collapsing, pending famine is also on the rise, and we have seen, I'm sure many people here today have seen the reports of families not having adequate nutrition and children being treated for malnutrition in areas where medical treatment is available. We have local actors on the ground trying to deliver services and goods and support, but those supplies for humanitarian actors are dwindling, and many humanitarian actors who are permitted to be in the country, which tend to be those who are Afghan themselves, are reliant on independent ways of being funded. And again, the amount of organization that is required for that makes them unable to deliver as much as the need is presented. So with that, I thank you again for being here today and for this time to give a brief opener of my observations and opening remarks. Something that I haven't touched on, but I think is important to understand also, the nomadic targeted ethnic violence for the Hazara nationals specifically. Sorry, I forgot to mention this in my earlier remarks. The Hazaras tend to be in the northern Afghanistan, and they are fairly nomadic, and they're targeted. They're being targeted for their ethnicity to the point that many international humanitarian actors, while it had always been thus, their situation is their targeting is on the increase to the point of having genocidal tendencies. So with that complexity added into the backdrop, and being that they are nomadic and don't have places to have safe passage along any point of their journey, I'm also very concerned about their future. So thank you for these opening remarks. I'll pass the baton over to Corey. Thank you.
Thanks, Athena. I'll just jump in. Thank you for giving us that larger view. And just before Corey speaks, for the folks in the audience, I know Corey very well. She's been in and out of Afghanistan since 2002, just coming back And I know she's been working night and day, like I said in my opening, to look after Afghans inside Afghanistan still and those that are coming here. So Corey, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thank you for those great remarks that sort of set the tone. And thank you to Royal Roads and particularly Dr. Athena Madan for organizing this and for her wonderful remarks that really places the crisis in context. I'd also like to thank Dr. Weiss Aria in advance because I know that not only he brings professional experience, but also personal experience. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Listening to what both Chris and Athena have said, I'm going to alter my remarks a little bit. But Athena did a great job of laying out, as I said, the complexities and the starkness of the realities. I'd like to add on a few things to that. Before Kabul fell, there were already 3.5 million IDPs in Afghanistan that have been displaced over the years of the conflict have been going has been going on, and there are no, to use UNE's language, durable solutions have been found for them. And as Athena mentioned, now since I think it was since January, you had Athena that almost 700,000 more have been added to that role, which represents more than 10% of the population. We've seen the stark numbers coming out of international organizations, I should say, that while there are local aid agencies operating, the UN more or less has been operating, particularly the humanitarian side, throughout. They were mostly evacuated to Uzbekistan, and now most of the UN agencies have returned to Kabul and are operating as much as they can in this current situation. And some of the numbers that they are giving are almost half of the country are experiencing severe food insecurity. 1 in 3 Afghans are already saying that they are experiencing acute hunger. 50% of children under 5 are malnourished. And UNDP came up with an alarming statistic the other day that as much as 97% of the population is at risk of sinking below the poverty line within 6 months if there is not massive intervention. And I mention all of these statistics because they impact the displaced population, predominantly. There's the current humanitarian crisis, but then there are additional issues that have been plaguing Afghanistan, including the COVID-19 crisis, of course, where it's a global pandemic. Only the elites have managed to be vaccinated, or at least it was when I left at the end of June, and I can't imagine that the Taliban are making a pressing effort to ensure that the vast majority of Afghans get vaccinated. And I raise this again in conjunction with IDPs because it's very difficult to physically distance or self-isolate when you're living 10 people in a tent all closely together, which is the way the vast majority of IDPs are living. And then on top of this, Afghanistan has experienced a significant drought in the past year, which has caused wheat crops to fall, livestock prices to significantly drop, and shortages in drinking water. And the reason that this is critical is because 70% of Afghans live in rural areas, and millions depend on agriculture for their livelihood. So again, just laying on top of the already drastic conditions that are in Afghanistan. But it is really the abrupt halt to the development of assistance that has um, put the country into the crisis that it exists now. Because at, approximately 75% of the previous government's budget was made up of development assistance. So that has completely stopped. And so what we're now seeing is the country really on the brink, if already not is sliding down to total collapse. And again, all of this impacts on IDPs the hardest. Just to pick up on the points about Athena mentioned regarding the delivery of aid, the impact of Taliban policies has exacerbated this, particularly with regard to the Taliban's prohibition around women's employment. Previously, the majority of local aid workers were women. They are being able to continue um, in their roles, but in a very limited capacity. Only 3 provinces out of 34 are allowing women aid workers unrestricted access to do the job. Most of them are requiring them to have a mayram, which is a male family member chaperone. Or that they are limiting them to just doing conducting assessments rather than delivering aid. With a growing number of women-only households, this is going to make, and particularly also within the IDP population, this makes it more difficult to access aid. So where do we go from here? Because of this absolute crisis, this has put the international community into a very difficult situation. It means negotiating with a government that attained power by force, that they are not a legitimate government, and they don't reflect the will of the majority of the population. It's a legal, practical, and ethical minefield. Um, Humanitarian aid alone is not going to prevent economic collapse, but neither the Taliban nor the donors have a vision of what to do next. At the moment, donors are operating on a triage basis. They're trying to stem the bleeding, but beyond that, there is absolutely no understanding or scheme of how to address these catastrophic problems. While humanitarian aid is continuing, albeit patchy, a resumption in development aid is going to be far trickier. Um, Donors will likely and should try to leverage their assistance to extract demands that the Taliban has no interest in. However, and it's important to remember, this is not the first time that the international community has been engaging with the Taliban. They were working with them when the Taliban were in power from 1996 to 2001, and also during the past couple of years in recent negotiations. The Taliban have actually shown themselves to be able negotiators, excelling at sticking to their goals and grinding down the other side with tedious and frivolous demands. So now that they are in control of the country, they are unlikely to accept concessions that donors will place on them in exchange for funding, particularly regarding the rights of women and children. But I will end my remarks by saying, when the Taliban were last in power, Afghanistan was actually a very different country. It was much poorer, less educated, and more rural, even with 70% of Afghans still living within rural areas. More people have higher expectations of what to expect from life and government. Young Afghans have come of age in a country increasingly connected to the modern world, and we can see this in the changes in the way the Taliban is conducting themselves. They've become very savvy with regard to social media in particular. Globalization, digital connectivity, and 20 years of investment in education mean that Afghans are now generally better informed and more mobile. So I think the jumping off point is, how can we continue our support to Afghanistan so that Afghans themselves can continue to push for their rights? It's been tragic to speak with friends, former colleagues, mostly women, who have just in the blink of an eye have the rug pulled out under them. Many of them are at risk, are facing an extremely uncertain future. We need to continue demanding that our countries step in. And I'm happy to speak more about that, about what Canada's response has been and needs to be with regard to getting Afghans out in the question and answer period. Thanks so much, and I look forward to hearing what Dr. Weiss Adia has to say.
Thank you, Corey. You raised so many important points. Just watching the news, for example, from Al Jazeera in the last day or so, you're seeing young girls who are saying, "Hey, we're missing out an entire school year." I mean, so much more savvy. And then you move to the markets where older men generally are saying, before the Taliban, I was making $270 a month, and now I'm making $20 a month. And so the impact through society is beginning to spread. I know Weiss has a much better view of this than certainly I do. And so I'm going to turn over the microphone to Weiss. Weiss, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks from you, Corey and Dr. Tina, for inviting me for today's series. It's very hard to start from Afghanistan. So let me to elaborate some point about the IDPs, and I will come to current situation, what is going on. My 20 years experience shows IDP change day by day. I'm also one of Afghan citizen, which I experienced many times displacement inside of Afghanistan. But my experience was totally different from current situation. I believe Korea have good experience from Afghanistan and visited many times IDPs. But the current IDP is totally different from it used to be in the past, like just before Taliban. I can say even in IDP camps, they had better life from their own community, because most of the IDP camps received a lot of international aid, like a school. We had medical clinic, and we have a partnership with Rose Charity Canada, which is based on Vancouver. We did a lot of work in IDP. So they received like tents, shelters, something. But my experience, what shows to me before August and during the August, which I went to work with IDP in Afghanistan, the recent IDP, after the US decided to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan, the international aid also reduced, and they could not control the situation. And we had many IDPs in the park which they don't receive the international aid, like the shelters, tents, school supplies for children, for women. So this is totally different from the IDP from 5 years or 10 years or even a years ago. Nowadays, they survive in a disaster. There is no shelter for them. There is no winterization program. Even there is no livelihood program. So, but it is not ending the story, and it is not the holistic situation of IDP in Afghanistan. So recently I have contacted with many media activists, like human rights activists. We have an IDP also, the people who used to work with military, with like media or with international community. They could not evacuate the country, and they are not qualified to apply for Canada or US or other country. So just they kept hiding themselves in a different places. For example, it is not like a one or two or 100, it is thousand people. So they displaced from one place to other place in big cities. Just they keep them in a hidden place, like in a basement of other family member, or just they living in a casual places in order the Taliban do not recognize them. So this is the other part of the situation. And beside that, like thousand people waiting to receive passport and evacuate the country, because there is a limitation to receive the passport, and the Taliban again stopped in Kabul especially to receive the passport. But still there is high corruption. So if you pay enough good money, and you can receive the passport. One of the big challenges for the people like civil society activists, they have cases with US, with Canada, with other countries. Recently, they cannot evacuate the country without passport. This is also one of the big challenges for people in Afghanistan. We are in touch with different people, especially our colleagues from Vancouver. They're trying to collect some donation, especially support our own organization staff, because as long as the Taliban came in Afghanistan, our organization totally collapsed and we stopped our operation. Still, we are in touch. We do some remote work or virtual work, but all of them, they don't have like $1 income in a month. One of the big challenges how to like do fund channelization to Afghanistan. It is one of the big challenges for international community at the moment, because the Taliban is under sanction, and it is hard to send money in Afghanistan. And I'm in touch with many international community organization and people. So I'm suggesting also from this mic, if we find this solution and we have a suggestion, especially my suggestion is to that United Nations have a like branch of a bank. I don't know how it would be practical, at least that this non-profit organization could receive some of their fund. Otherwise, you know, with Afghan banks, it is pretty hard to send money. It is easy to send to Afghanistan, but it's pretty hard to pick up money from the bank. So, and unfortunately, recently I received this news from Wall Street Journal that maybe in 2-3 months, all Afghan banks would be bankrupt and would not exist any bank in Afghanistan, which is not good news for Afghanistan at the moment. So this is the situation, and people has very tough life, especially children and women are at high risk of abuse and traffic within IDP camps. We can see at the moment the IDP changed totally the picture which used to be. So it is not like an IDP from as a result of war or as a result of natural disaster, but it is more like a group of people they displaced as a result of political situation. It is all overall my remark about current situation in Afghanistan. So if you have any question or I do not cover any part, just as a last thing, I wanted to point, there is another big challenges for Hazara tribe in Afghanistan. They're totally marginalized in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, systematically, they targeted recently in different places, like even in big cities. For example, in Kabul, we are witness of 2-3 explosion, and hiddenly just the Taliban and other terrorist group looking for excuse by the name of ISIS, by the name of so you have gun or you have illegal political activity, they arrest and they killed in different places. That is not limited only for Hazara, it's included for other people also, especially for those who used to work with military, with Afghanistan government or media. So they targeted, and also the evacuation process become very complex issue in a current situation. People receive fake emails, and so many scams send them emails or from private number calls and asking money. People are illiterate, and some people coming and they says, we give you a recommendation later. I fill up the form for you in order to apply for immigration, and people borrow money from. So it is a big challenge, especially for the people who are well educated and they want to leave the country.
Thank you, Weiss. Thank you, panelists. We do have questions that have come in while you were speaking. They range from the strategic to the on-the-ground work that I know all of you have done. There is a question on this at the strategic level, which I'll take a quick stab at before turning things over to you. And it's about, what countries are supporting the Taliban and the position of Pakistan, India, and Russia, and so forth. And that could be the whole subject of another session. But I think it's safe to say that the European Union, the United States, and Canada, and many countries are walking on eggshells as they try to figure out how they will get aid into the country without, at the same time, supporting the Taliban in some fashion. But I think it's unavoidable, because if you are feeding people and looking after them, you're taking that pressure off of the Taliban government. But everybody's working on eggshells there. Now, you have seen countries like Qatar and Turkey very soon after the airport was closed, heading right back in with specialists and opening up the airport and trying to lend a hand where they can. But many of these countries just do not have the economic resources that the European Union has, and the United States, and so on. And of course, Pakistan and Russia and China have all played a part and all hosted meetings with the Taliban, but they too do not have the resources on hand that a country like Canada or the United States and so forth is willing to dedicate. So we have a lot of people circling around, but nothing definitive, I would say, on that. But let me move forward onto this. And Corey, could I just come back to you and ask about this is an important question, because we talk about young girls going to school in Afghanistan, but is it just something that's been, is it just in the major cities? And Weiss, you'll know about this too, so please join in. What about education for, say, young girls in the more rural areas? Was it actually happening, or was the conservatism in those rural districts having a part to play? Weiss, you go ahead.
Yes, as long as the Taliban came in Afghanistan, the drop rate of school is pretty high, even for boys also. There is no hope for people to get education. I can give an example from my family. My nephew is not going longer to school. He is 18 years old, and he was just in the last years of school. So he says, I don't want to go longer to school because there is no hope for me. And related to education for girls, in most provinces which was under Taliban control, because of the culture, because of limitation of school and teacher, there was not education for girls. Only in some places it was up to grade 6 or 7, and some big cities it was up to grade 12. But of course, Korea and Athena knows that, for example, Iraq, Balkh, Jalalabad, and some more other big cities, they had university. But at the moment, the education system is totally down. There is no hope for people to go to school. In Kabul city, and the girls going to school up to grade 6, and the teacher do not receive their stipend for 3 months. But the women are totally limited. So at the moment, they do not say that they should not go to private university, and private schools are open. At the beginning, when they came, they just put a like partition between girls and boys, but it's not longer exist. But the number of students, like I can say 60% dropped compared to versus to like 3 months ago. This is the situation. And then just in some city in Iraq and Balkh, it confirmed 2-3 schools they start up to grade 12 for girls, but it is not something be official. Just some girls visited their school, they allowed them to go to library and meet with teachers. Since the teachers they do not receive their salaries, and it's not like it to be a standard or official school for them.
Thank you. Corey.
Yes, thanks for that question and for ways for your comments, because yeah, I mean, the situation, of course, has changed since the Taliban came into power. But at the beginning, like in the early years, you saw a huge in numbers of enrollment across the country, not just in the urban areas, but in the rural areas. But as the conflict heated up, and rural schools in particular were targeted, this impacted greatly on the ability to girls to go to school. So you saw dwindling numbers in particular for girls accessing education. And I think WAYS has done a great job of pointing out the inconsistencies. Nobody's really sure. And it seems to vary from province to province what's going on. Athena actually illustrated that in her remarks. There's no one monolithic Taliban. I think that's important to remember. That's why I brought in the issue around women aid workers, and each province is modulating their own, determining how they're going to move forward. And this is in the case of education as well. But before I turn it over to Athena, I'd like to just touch on one point that you talked about in terms of the strategic level. What we're seeing, and this is reflected in what's happening in within the UN, that there are tensions between the humanitarian organizations within the body of UN agencies whose mandate is to ensure humanitarian assistance, and the human rights aspects of those of the UN framework, where there's not a lot of trust, that the sense is that those components within the UN working on human rights will somehow hinder if they join in with the delivery of humanitarian aid because of their stance around the Taliban. Okay, so I'll pass it over to Athena now. Thanks.
Dr. Athena, before you start, do you mind to pick up some questions from the chat room also? We need to respond to those questions also.
Yeah, we do, Weiss, and I'm looking at those as those questions are coming in, and it's quite inspiring actually to see the trading of information that's going on in the chat between people that are involved in bringing Afghans to Canada and looking after them while they're still in country. There was one particular question, Weiss, that I think perhaps you and Athena would be interested in, but I think Weiss might be a little speaking right now. But it's about the psychosocial supports. You know, we have people in Afghanistan who are IDPs. We're bringing people into Canada who have had very difficult situations in country and then getting here. What sort of psychosocial supports are available in your experience, either in Afghanistan or even here on the ground? So let me, Weiss, let me go to Athena to take that question first, and then we'll go to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for that question, and Dr. Aria Weiss and myself. There's so much that we could say about this. Perhaps we can put another webinar, actually. And there are so many resources that are being exchanged in the chat box that I think we should probably honor those experiences and that knowledge to continue these conversations. So about the mental health and psychosocial supports, let me just give a very brief response to what we can do in Canada, and then I'll turn the mic over to Weiss. So I am connected to groups of professionals who are organizing, who include Afghan citizens and Afghan expats, as well as Canadian-based professionals who are looking at this area. So some of the resources available to support the trauma associated with the lived experiences. I agree with you in that in Canada, we don't necessarily have a framework to understand the culturally sensitive approaches and needs for people from Afghanistan living in the Afghan context, as well as understanding what culturally might be appropriate to support them in their recoveries. And I think John also said that the stress doesn't stop when they come to Canadian soil. So culture shock is also very important, belonging and befriending. So for those of you who are not connected to professional networks, understanding how to connect with your local settlement agency is often useful, who are resettling Afghan refugees, and just helping with befriending, helping with cultural literacies, supports, and yes, of course, the needs for things like clothing and blankets are always there, but needs for friends and communities and acceptance is also key too, in order to helping resettle. Part of my research is also looking at providing culturally relevant and sensitive mental health interventions for people who are Afghan. And these are things that we need to embed in our systems as well. So I do have a couple of handouts that you can disseminate out to your networks if that's useful, so you can get in touch, and then also your local settlement agencies. And then I will pass the mic over to Weiss. And I see that John has also put his email address to be connected with. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So since the mental health and psychosocial is my expertise, so the demand is pretty high and the service provider is very limited. What I have done in Afghanistan, also in US, and currently I can show my ID, and I'm in one of mental health and psychosocial center, exactly in one of military camp, which we have 8,000 guests, and I can show you the place later on. So at 1:30, I have a session with man. So the best and effective way to deliver mental health and psychosocial support for refugee, even for IDPs, community-based psychosocial support program, which I designed 2 manuals for UNICEF, also related to children, as well for women and men. So since I started my work in one of US military base for Afghan refugee, I came with same approach, which is very effective, and they accepted that. And usually I conduct psychoeducation session about stress management, as Dr. Atina pointed about culture crash and adaptation. So more related to their core value, to discuss those points, and also some sort of stress management, which is more pressure in this country. So these are the program. I also suggest for other organizations, if they wanted to work, please consider their core culture and core value. In it, it's include Afghan culture, religion. It's part of mental health support for them, and it is one of the big demand for a refugee. I can show you, if you don't mind, if you can see in the camera, this is our center. I'm not sure how it looks. We have some toys here for children, and we have like some yoga classes, even it's not part of mental health support, but we do like more supportive group, because we have still like counselors and therapists to work with individuals, but honestly, we have limitation of like, sorry, my camera came off. The limitation of therapists is pretty limit, and we cannot respond for demand, because for each therapist we have to have an interpreter, and when we have an interpreter they cannot express their need or what they wanted to say. Therefore we prefer to have more in a supportive group session and support them. At the end we design another manual like community education, and whom visiting by a expert to follow with them what is their need and how they deal with the current situation, or how they adopt in a new culture in US.
Weiss, thank you for that. And I believe you're based in Washington. Am I correct?
Yes, I'm based in Virginia at the moment. I'm in Richmond. It's Fort Pickett, one of the biggest camp, which hosted like 8,500 Afghan guests.
And while I have you here, I wanted to ask your opinion, because we've had some questions about the role of Pakistan, which of course has its own problems, economic and otherwise. How do you sense the relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan? Is there any sort of mitigating influence that Pakistan can have going forward?
There is no doubt. I don't want to make more our attempts to politic, but it is the reality. Pakistan is one of the biggest and ongoing influential for Taliban, and they supported from 19 up to now. And nowadays still play very active role in a future of Afghanistan, Pakistan. And the same time, because there is a lot of international pressure on them, and they don't want it to recognize, take care of Taliban government officially. Otherwise, officially they are in Kabul, they decide and they give advice. But from a refugee aspect, people do not feel comfortable and they do not feel safe to move to Pakistan. And then evacuate from Pakistan, especially those who used to work with the US mission in Afghanistan, or they used to work with the US Afghanistan government in military part. But from other hand, the big challenges have they go to Iran. From Iran, it is super hard to evacuate and come to US. So it is the big challenges for people. Only in the past there was opportunity to move to Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, but there is no good relation. And again, I can come back to about the passport. Passport is the big challenges for people who wants to leave the country.
Thank you, Weiss. And I wanted to then ask Corey and Athena, from a Canadian perspective. We do know that approximately 4,000 Afghans have come to Canada. Do we have any kind of breakdown on the ratio of men to women and children? And they seem to be going to all sorts of communities from coast to coast to coast. But do you have any insights into the numbers?
I'll jump in first, and don't get me started. The frustrations that I feel about our governmental response are monumental. The government themselves aren't breaking down these numbers. Nobody really has any idea. I apologize. I haven't really been keeping up with the chat, but I will try, and I will also put my email in the chat if people want to follow up with me directly, because there are so many different levels and layers to this issue. You have mentioned, or somebody had mentioned earlier, about the vaunted 40,000 at-risk vulnerable Afghans. Nobody really knows what has happened with them. The vast majority have been, to date, those Afghans who have assisted the Canadian efforts, and that is not to take away from the necessity of and from the efforts to bring them here. I think that is incredibly important, and we all have to remember that. But at the same time, the government hasn't figured out really a pathway to bring in those 40,000. It's also not clear what that number really means, because how many of the 40,000 were already commitments that Canada had made to refugees in the pipeline or to family reunification or others. So there's not a lot of clarity. The government has pretty much been on hold with all of this since the writ was dropped, the election writ was dropped, and is now, Parliament has just started back this week. The new ministers of Defense, Global Affairs, and Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, they're all new to their posts, and they've been the main ministries leading the efforts to date. So there's going to be a lot of catching up to do. And one last thing that I'll have to, that I'd like to say, or actually two last things before I turn it over to Athena, is that we need to continue to advocate to the government to ensure that Afghanistan stays on the radar of the government. As you pointed out, Chris, there's a lot of other issues that are taking Afghanistan out of the news and out of the minds of Canadians. But going back to the 40,000, or just all Afghans, we need to press the government to expedite the evacuation process. We need to get the government to advocate with neighboring countries to open their borders and to align efforts to establish effective and efficient resettlement processes. As Ways pointed out, it's very difficult to get passports. I should also say it's very difficult to get visas. There's a lot of corruption and bribery going there. I've heard of stories of people being actually stopped at the border. They paid a lot of money for visas that were then, it turned out to be fake. Canada needs to designate Afghans as prima facie refugees, which means that the requirements to be recognized as a refugee by UNHCR or another government body or partner agency, that is waived. Canada needs to establish special operations centers in those countries where there are a lot of flows of Afghans coming in, to set up processing centers. And they need to set a timeline for bringing in the 40,000. Most of this Canada already did with the refugee crisis, bringing in 25,000 Syrians in 2015 in 100 days. They have the capacity to do this with the Afghan crisis, but they're not acting. So they need to hear from Canadians. And with that, I'll turn it over to Athena. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Athena, over to you.
No, I think everything that I was going to say, Corey, is beautifully already advocated for. So thanks. To answer the questions, I'll pass the mic back to you.
Yeah, so there have been a few other questions coming in Pakistan, and I know we don't want to focus on the political side of life, but I would say, in a short answer, being military myself and having studied insurgencies and so forth, seldom do insurgencies succeed without some sort of home base that you can return to, a border that you can cross, where you can be relatively safe and not have the militaries that you're fighting following you because of this border. And so this played very well for the Taliban, as it did when, of course, we cannot forget when the West funded the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets and the Afghan government from that period of 1979 to 1989. So whenever I talk about Afghanistan, I always I always say that we've all had a hand in the the horrible situation that we've seen there. And it's just so sad that we weren't able to progress any more than we had. The other issue, I think, is, as Corey said, is a lack of, do we have the right people on the ground in neighboring countries? And I'm not so sure, because we're not getting any information on that. Ahmed Hamidi has asked, who is the Canadian representative, in Afghanistan for us now officially? And I would venture to say that we don't have that. We probably don't even have a country that we turn to, like in Syria. We turn to Romania to look after our interests there when Canadians are in trouble. So, I don't know if any of you panelists know who's looking after our interests right now in Afghanistan. Corey, have you heard anything on your net?
I know that the ambassador to Afghanistan, the Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan, Reed Sears, is still considered the ambassador, although he's operating from Canada. Mm-hmm. And I have not heard anything about Canadian staff being on the ground in Afghanistan. They're not even able to bring up to speed the number of staff that they need to here in Canada. Like, they have call centers. Afghans call them, Canadians call them. They don't have enough people. The people that are taking these calls are not informed about anything. Cases are falling through the cracks. Nobody seems to know what's going on the ground here in Canada, let alone in Afghanistan. So I really want to reiterate that we need to pressure our government to step up and do something about this. It's a crisis here in Canada. And I think in the chat, someone have mentioned about what kinds of support services there are for Afghans coming into Canada. It seems to be very, very little, minimal. Afghans who managed to get out in the chaos of the evacuations in August are still stuck in motels 3 months later because there's no housing for them. There are very few culturally sensitive agencies who are able to help Afghans adapt. I will give a shout out to one organization in Toronto, which is where the vast majority of Afghan refugees are going to, the Afghan Women's Organization for Refugee and Immigrant Services. They've been around for almost 30 years and have spent the past 30 years assisting Afghans in this process. But that is really critical, and there are very few organizations. There are Afghan Canadian groups in different cities across the country, but I don't know their capacity to be able to take on the numbers of refugees that should, inshallah, be coming into the country.
Thank you, Corey. And I see it's 10:11 and we just have a few minutes left. So I'd just like to make a couple of quick comments before I'm going to turn the floor over to Athena, because of course Royal Roads University has been instrumental in putting on the event today, and the team there as well. One of the things that we discussed before we went live this morning is the simple fact that Afghanistan has largely dropped off of our media, our social media, our televisions and so forth, because other crises are impacting the world, and this is not new, of course. We have the situation in Ethiopia, we have the issue with Belarus and Poland, with refugees there, the Iranian nuclear talks, the list goes on. And then very quickly, we forget about Afghanistan. But one of the things that has happened this morning, which came clear to me, was all of the back and forth going on inside the chat. And it tells me that there is great space for us, and I'm thinking Royal Road, supported by CIC, of course, to carry on with these events, because I'm not seeing too many other organizations across the country running events on Afghanistan. It's very much China also, and it's taking that space. There is a niche here, I think, that we should really take on and keep the conversation going, and bringing in experts like Corey, and clearly some of the people in the chat who are quite busy, as we can see. So for me, just speaking on behalf of me and CIC, it's been a real delight to be a part of this panel and to have everybody attend and to hear your stories in the chat. I'm going to turn the floor over to Athena now to close this out. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris, and I agree, and thank you also for the opportunity and invitation to continue this conversation. I'm seeing people also agreeing with you in the chat box. I've connected also with I believe it was John, who was from Afghan Canadian Interpreters, for a webinar potential opportunity. So I think that perhaps we can endeavor to do this. So I'll have conversations about this offline, and I welcome other people to continue attending and also contact us if you have voices to bring to the conversation as well. I mean, today marks day 100 of Taliban taking power in Kabul. So this is appropriate that we are reflecting back and looking forward, but not ceasing to act. So I think Corey beautifully advocated also for what we need to continue to do as members of the international community who have had responsibilities in Afghanistan, need to continue those responsibilities in our capacities from afar. So I'm respectful and mindful of people's time. So thank you for being here today. And thank you, Chris, for moderating. And I don't really, Selena, are there words that I need to say for closeout? Selena's mentioned that we'll be sure to include the resources shared in today's webinar, as well as the recording links to our past webinars for those eager to listen. And I think to be continued. So yeah, thanks for being connected here, and stay connected with us. And thank you, Grace, for joining us. Okay.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again.
See you.
Pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.